skip a couple of decades and leapfrog to the final section of your book, which
We can
covers
do
the
that.
1980 period through today. And the connection point between what you just said and this, you brought up the idea of ownership of new consumer goods as a form of status. And so if you go straight to 2008 and the financial meltdown, fueled in large measure
Mm-hmm.
by home ownership, which, as you describe in the book, was really encouraged by George W. Bush's administration, who wanted to see this ownership society. And maybe on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's wrong with an ownership society, but for the fact that people couldn't afford to own it. And so they were making increasingly risky gambles to
Mm-hmm.
own. But that connection point there seems to be that of status, that idea of home ownership tying to status. There seems to be a bit of a through line from 1950s consumerism through.
That's good.
So let's talk about that period, how it came to be that you had this market meltdown, as I mentioned, in some way fostered by federal policy in more
Yep.
than anything else, residential real estate.
Yeah. So maybe come back to this idea of income politics. So, income politics comes out of the industrial period, and it reaches its culmination, I think, in the post-war period, where you have historically a relatively muted level of household income inequality because of union power, collective bargaining, because of the rise of the welfare state. But the economy structurally really changes in the 1980s. It's a very complex story, but the outcome is that the economy begins to hinge much more so, again, really think about the beginning of our conversation, on the ownership of property as opposed to income through wages and salaries. I call this the asset price appreciation game. Since the 1980s, on the whole, stocks go up. The value of bonds recently has gone up. Financial assets go up, 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 and you can leverage their value by accessing new forms of credit. It's largely a game, we think about property ownership, played by the rich, because in order to benefit from property, one has to own it. And so, by definition, you're talking about the wealthy. They're the ones who happen to own wealth. The 2000s and the real estate mortgage market, and ultimately the bust, represent something like an aberration. Maybe not an aberration, it's probably not the right word. It represents a genuine attempt by the administration of George W. Bush to open up this asset price appreciation game to the masses. And the way you would do it would be through owning a home. And the way you own a home is going into mortgage debt. So it's a genuine attempt, I think, to broaden out or spread the base of this asset price appreciation game. It doesn't work. And you mentioned why. I mean, you mentioned the critical reasons why, but income growth since the 1970s, in the middle of the distribution, average wages have stalled. And so if you're not growing incomes, you don't have an income sufficient to pay your mortgage, the only way you can survive is if the value of the home, the value of the asset, keeps going up, up, up. But if values ever reverse for any reason, the house of cards collapses. And that's essentially what happened in 2008.
Am I correct? And perhaps I'm projecting here, but I thought your tone shifted a little bit as you described this period in the book, that I picked up almost a sense of contempt for some of the games the financial players, I think you called it the synthetic asset class. You brought up these complicated acronyms like MBS, OTC, CDS, SIV, CDO, which were various ways that financiers packaged this type of mortgage debt, which ultimately led to the collapse of residential real estate. First of all, maybe you could just tell me, did I pick up on something real, or maybe I was just projecting into your writing? But am I correct that you just seem to be very contemptuous of some of the broader decisions that had been made by people in power at that point?
You're right. And this actually ties back into one of the earlier questions on capitalism and thinking about, communication more broadly. As a historian, you're committed to getting the story right. The facts matter. And in writing history, for the most part, you try to suppress your own moral or political view of the subject. At the same time, there are moments where it feels important as a writer and also just as a human being to communicate how you feel about a subject, hoping that as you do that, you don't undermine your objectivity and authority as someone who's committed to getting the story right. And you're certainly correct that this was one of those moments for me in the book where I wanted to indicate, to the reader, just how awful and tragic this story was, and how egregious the behavior of a lot of, not all, but many of the bankers and financiers who were involved, in the mortgage market meltdown. I think one of the reasons I wanted to do that too was I still think, and this goes back to the theme of communication again, but one of the problems we have in American politics, as it relates to economic issues since 2008, is I still don't think there's been a public reckoning with what happened and who was responsible, the truth of the matter. As you suggested, government policy played a role here. There's plenty of blame to spread around. But that really, since 1980 through today, I argue, for the most part, elites, political elites, business elites, and I suppose I should throw in my class too, so-called academic elites, professors, have really failed, the large majority of the American people, that the economy doesn't work well for a very large percentage of the American public, or certainly not as well as it could, and that kind of using this moment to just say what I believe is that truth, that was something that I wanted to, communicate in this part of the book.
Thanks for watching this video clip of the Speak Good podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please check out our full conversations on your favorite podcast directory. We've spoken with everyone from the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution about what it was like to be the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, to a member of Congress who describes his day job as being in the wrestling ring, to an expert storyteller who helps us understand how we can use stories to help us achieve our business goals. Thanks for watching.